A young journalist thought he could humiliate Clint Eastwood, but he had no idea what was coming. The ballroom at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel was a scene of pure elegance. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm glow, their reflections dancing off the gold-trimmed walls. The air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, expensive perfume, and that subtle tension that lingered whenever Hollywood's elite gathered in one place. Guests in tailored suits and designer gowns drifted from table to table, their voices a murmur of industry gossip, forced laughter, and backhanded compliments. Some were here for a cause. The gala tonight supported veterans' mental health initiatives, but for many it was just another opportunity to network, get seen, and remind everyone of their place in the industry hierarchy. And then Clint Eastwood walked in. No entourage, no grand entrance, just him in a well-fitted black suit, hands casually tucked into his pockets, exuding a quiet confidence that needed no introduction. At 94 years old, he moved a bit slower than he once did, but there was still something in the way he held himself, something in the way his eyes scanned the room that commanded respect. Conversation shifted mid-sentence. Eyes darted in his direction. A few guests whispered to each other. Clint wasn't the kind of celebrity you gushed over. You simply acknowledged him, respected him. He approached a small group near the bar, greeting a couple of old friends with a firm handshake and leaning in slightly to hear their conversation over the soft jazz playing in the background. He wasn't one for small talk, but he had a way of making people feel that what they were saying truly mattered, a rare trait in this crowd. Across the ballroom, a young journalist named Brandon Keller was watching. He wasn't famous, but in the world of political commentary, he had carved out a name for himself as the fearless voice of a new generation. His articles, often attacks on outdated conservative figures, had earned him a decent following on social media. Tonight he saw an opportunity to make a statement. Clint Eastwood was a relic, a man out of touch with the modern Hollywood narrative. Keller was determined to make a stand, but the way his eyes lit up, a mix of arrogance and excitement, suggested he had already decided how this encounter would unfold. He wasn't here for a discussion. He was here for a takedown. Keller straightened his tie, grabbed his phone, already set to record, and made his way through the crowd. He wasn't nervous. He was confident, too confident. This wasn't just about challenging an old actor's views. It was about creating a viral moment, making a scene. As he approached, the energy around the bar shifted slightly. Some guests stepped back, sensing an interruption. Clint, who had been listening to a war veteran's story, barely acknowledged Keller's presence. That only fueled Keller's determination. He cleared his throat, flashed a tight-lipped smile, and said loudly enough to draw attention, "Mr. Eastwood, I'm Brandon Keller with the Sentinel Review. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Eastwood gave him a quick, unreadable glance and then returned to his conversation. Keller didn't like that. He took a step closer. "I'll make it quick," he added, forcing a chuckle. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on Hollywood's changing landscape. You've been in the industry for over 60 years. Do you think people like you still have a place in it?" The subtle jab was deliberate. People like you hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few guests nearby turned their attention to the exchange. Someone set their drink down a little too loudly, and even the bartender paused for a second mid-pour. Eastwood finally looked at Keller, his gaze steady, as if deciding whether or not this was worth his time. Keller pressed on. "Hollywood is evolving," he continued. "The old ways of thinking, the outdated masculinity, the conservative values. A lot of people believe it's time to move forward. The guys like you are out of touch with what modern audiences want." There it was, the line Keller had been waiting for. He had set the stage perfectly. He was on camera, surrounded by an audience, standing toe-to-toe with a Hollywood legend. This was his moment. He could already picture the headline. Clint Eastwood finally called out. Watch him stumble over his own ignorance. But that headline was about to crumble. Another round of laughter erupted from the crowd. Someone even clapped. Keller's face turned red, but he wasn't ready to back down. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice a little tighter, "it's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when you were part of a generation that had it easier." A murmur ran through the room, not in Keller's favor. A few guests exchanged glances, unimpressed by the weak argument. Eastwood let out a short laugh. shaking his head. Easier, he repeated as if the word was the dumbest thing he'd heard all night. I started in Hollywood when they still told actors like me to change their name because it sounded too rough. I worked as a bricklayer before I ever got in front of a camera. You think it was easier? He let the question hang in the air for a beat. You ever had to shovel asphalt in the middle of summer just to afford a meal? Keller blinked, unprepared for that. But Eastwood wasn't done. I've seen guys like you before, he said, taking another sip of his drink. You're looking for a sound bite, hoping to make a scene. But here's the thing. You walked in here thinking I was going to fold, that I'd get mad, stumble over my words, maybe even storm off. He shrugged. I don't do performances on command. That's your job. The crowd laughed again. This time, it wasn't a few people, but nearly half the room. Some even applauded. Keller could feel it. The realization that things weren't going the way he'd planned. He'd lost control. Still, he tried to salvage it. All right, he said, clearing his throat. So maybe you had some struggles. But don't you think there's a reason people your age are being left behind in Hollywood? Maybe audiences don't want outdated ideas shoved down their throats anymore. Eastwood chuckled again, but this time it wasn't amused. It was more disappointed. Left behind, he repeated, shaking his head. Son, I've outlived entire Hollywood trends. I've been written off more times than I can count. And yet here I am. And here you are, talking to me, at my table, at my event, using my name to try and make a headline. Keller opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the room was deafening. A guest muttered, "Damn." The weight of it all settled over Keller. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. They weren't waiting for him to take down an old Hollywood legend. They were watching him squirm. Desperate for an exit, Keller blurted, I just think people deserve better. Better stories. Better representation. Better... Eastwood interrupted him with a slow, knowing nod. So tell them then, he said. Keller blinked, confused. What? Eastwood leaned back in his chair, staring him down. You keep saying what people don't want, so tell them what they do want, right now. Go ahead. Say something that matters more than the movies I've made, the people I've worked with, or the history I've been a part of. Keller had nothing. His hands curled into fists at his sides. His breath became uneven. His whole plan had been about tearing someone down, but now, standing in front of Clint Eastwood, he was being asked to build something. And he couldn't do it. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, and he felt the room close in around him. The whispers, the glances, the realization that his entire narrative had fallen apart. Thought so, Eastwood finally said, taking another sip of his drink. The crowd laughed again, but this time it wasn't just amusement. It was finality. The moment was over. Keller had lost, and deep down, he knew it. Brandon Keller swallowed hard, humiliation flooding his face. He'd walked into this confrontation thinking he'd emerge as the voice of a new era. Instead, he stood exposed, a young man who had overestimated himself in the presence of someone who had already seen it all. As Keller slinked away, his mind racing, Clint Eastwood didn't gloat. He didn't even seem invested in the outcome. He simply took another sip of his drink, then turned back to the conversation with the veteran, as if nothing had happened. A few feet away, a middle-aged producer shook his head and chuckled. You didn't have to do him like that. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. I didn't do anything. Oh, come on, the producer said, smirking. You let that kid walk right into a buzzsaw. Eastwood cracked a small grin. He walked into it himself. I just didn't move it out of the way. The producer laughed. You know they'll twist this. They'll make you look like the bad guy. Eastwood shrugged. They've been doing that for years, he said. Doesn't change the truth. Across the room, another guest muttered to a friend. Man, these people really think they can out-talk Clint Eastwood. They keep trying, the friend replied. But every time, the outcome's the same. And so the night continued. Champagne flowed. Deals were whispered over candlelit tables. Hollywood's elite carried on with their conversations, unaware of the lesson that had just unfolded before them. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about generational divides. It wasn't even about winning or losing. It was about wisdom versus arrogance. Clint Eastwood had lived long enough to understand that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one with something worth saying. Brandon Keller, for all his bravado, was part of a world where performative outrage was currency, where tearing people down was easier than building something meaningful. He thought he could break down a Hollywood legend, but in doing so, he forgot that true value isn't found in destruction. It's found in creation. And by the time Keller slipped away into the crowd, he was just another name in the long line of people who underestimated the old cowboy. Clint Eastwood never needed to prove anything. He let his work speak for itself. Time would judge what truly mattered, and the people who tried to erase history would fade into irrelevance on their own. Because in the end, it's not about who screams the loudest. It's about who actually has something worth saying.